Yeah.
And we are recording. Okay, I think I may have done it right this time. Good evening, everybody. As most of you know, I'm Jordan Becker. I am the class secretary for the current class of 1982. And oh, there we go. Thank you. We have a really interesting program tonight about race and the arts. And before we turn it over to that, I did want to remind everybody that this coming Friday, April 16th, is the deadline to apply for the position of class of 82 diversity and inclusion chair. The application information was sent out to everybody by Julia. It was also, I believe, in the last class bulletin I sent out. And if I did this correctly, I'm going to put a link, yep, in the chat. So if you want to apply, there's a Google form. It's a pretty straightforward form asking you essentially, why do you want to do this? And why do you think you would be good at it? And what's your experience? And once you fill that out, it will be sent to the class officers. We will look at it, and then Julia will choose our first diversity and inclusion chair, which is pretty exciting. And so I did want to thank the people who asked for it, because you made an ask and we discussed it and we thought it was a great idea. With that, let me turn over the proceedings today to my longtime friend and fellow marching band member, lawyer and playwright, Mike Salmanson. Mike?
Thanks, Jordan. For those of you who have not attended these in the past, this is our, I think, fifth in our continuing discussions of racial equity and racial justice. It's a little bit different. If you noticed, you might not have noticed the subtlety, but a lot of our other topics have been, racial bias in fill in the blank. And this is very deliberately race and the arts, because while we are going to talk about racial inequities in the arts, and both the performing arts and the fine arts, we also want to talk very much about how the arts can hopefully help society address issues of race, be reflective of society as a whole, and perhaps push us forward. And then at the end, Kathie, I think, is going to take us through an actual real life exercise of some issues that confront people in the arts. So I know you all saw the short bios, but I'm just going to do it in case anybody wasn't paying attention. Our five panelists, assuming if Bobby shows up, include Kathie Motes Bennewitz, who's an independent art curator. And most interestingly for this panel is actually the town curator for the town of Westport, Connecticut, which means that she is charged with what's the verb form? The curating of the town's own art collection. And not surprisingly, lots of towns have, art in schools, public places, etc. Jacque Edmonds Cofer, in addition to living downstairs from me freshman year in a first entry Pine, went on to much greater things than I did. She's a co-executive producer of, among other things, 6 network comedies, most recently The Unicorn on CBS, and Dad Stop Embarrassing Me, starring Jamie Foxx on Netflix. Jacque, you're going to have to tell us what a showrunner is, since that's in your biography. But she was a showrunner of 4 series, including Let's Stay Together, which was BET's first original scripted comedy. Els Collins, veteran stage manager. Els, I think I remember you as directing a lot of stuff on Teen, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Is my stage managing well? and acting in, unfortunately. We corrected that.
And right. And so she now has a stage manager with over 25 years experience, currently serving as the head of production at the USC School of Dramatic Arts. Bobby Moya, a person unto himself. I first met him through Triangle, dancing away in the Act 1 finale of Stocks and Bondage. Bobby's been on Broadway, Vegas, Atlantic City, Europe, regional, summer stock. He's worked in front of the stage, behind the stage. He's now director, choreographer for live events in Puerto Rico, and he also engages with the school kids of all ages, as he likes to say. Boomie Pedersen, another person with a long career in the theater. She's the founding artistic director of the Hammer Theater, a project-based theater company down in Virginia, whose mission is to boldly serve and heal our communities through conversation-provoking theater and creative spaces. So with that, I'm going to try and give us some guiding questions. As usual, if you have questions for the panel, I think it's easiest, Jordan, to put them in the chat, or are we going to do raised hands?
Let's do raise hands, so that way I don't have to monitor the chat.
Okay.
Obviously, if you are shy or having which this is not the place to be shy, or if you're having sound problems and you really want to ask a question, please indicate in the chat the reason why, and we'll try to get to it. But frankly, the easiest thing is just raise your hand and we'll get to it later.
Okay. So I was going to start with Bobby and Jacque, but since Bobby's not here yet, Jacque, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to tell us a little bit about your experiences in the industry, whether you felt especially as a woman of color, whether you face certain barriers, obstacles, and or expectations in your role there, and just we'll start from there.
Okay, well, you ran off a bit of my resume there. I've been doing this for about 30 years. It's unbelievable to me. Before that, I went to, after Princeton, I went to Harvard Business School and had a brief, very unheralded corporate career. I was kind of bored with corporate world and heard about a writing program at Walt Disney Corporation. I was actually thinking of applying for a corporate job, but heard about this writing program, applied, and somehow got in, and for TV writing. And years of TV addiction paid off. Went on to my first staff writing job on the show Martin, and started running shows a few years after that with Living Single, Moesha, a bunch of shows through the 90s and 2000s. Most recently, I've been going back and forth between CBS and Netflix. And so during the 30 years, I mean, a lot has changed. A lot of things haven't, in terms of both representation for women and for people of color. When I first started, there were a limited number of Black cast shows, particularly in the sitcom world. They tended to have mostly white writers. And that certainly evolved with programs like the one that I came to the industry through, the Walt Disney program. Most of the studios have those sort of programs to bring in people of color, women, people who aren't from LA or New York, to try to diversify. Their success has been, they have a pretty good record, but as with all corporate efforts, there's a ceiling issue, there's a promotion issue, there's a retention issue. But, I've seen in my career, and particularly over the past 5 years, with the flourishing of different, we're way past from when we grew up and there were 3 networks. With the advent of streaming and 24-hour programming and a constant need for content, finally, I think the world is opening up because they just need more of everything. And that means more programming by and about women, more programming by and about people of color. For my own career, like I said, going back and forth between CBS and Netflix, the Netflix show that you mentioned with Jamie Foxx comes on Wednesday. When I was, and I think it's a perfect illustration of the problem in the industry. When I was hired, I was the only woman. Now the show is about a man raising his 14-year-old daughter. I said, how can you do that with no women on staff? And the white male showrunner told me, I have a 14-year-old daughter. So I don't know that cuts it. And then when we looked at the makeup of the staff, there were 5 white male writers who are all upper level writers, except for me. And there were 5 of the lowest level Black writers, 5 of the lowest level writers who were all Black. Again, a situation not uncommon from when I started 30 years ago. But I, at least I was there to hopefully, for a minute, to hopefully make some changes. And I sent you guys a couple of slides. Jordan, if you would throw up the first slide, I think it sort of illustrates a little bit of what I go through on a daily basis as a person of color and a woman, which I, live in, but don't see it as a limitation in any way. But I don't know if you can see, it's kind of small, but McKinsey put out a study just a couple months ago. I thought it was interesting because the first set of, the first set of odd little circles on the top, and this is just about Black people, shows a representation of actors on camera. These are the people that you see in film and TV. And it's grown from, and they show lead actors, the middle one is background actors, and then the US population. So after 30 years in the business, we're finally seeing representation of Black actors at about parity with the US population. Certainly not the same for Asian Pacific Islander or Latino, Latinx community, but at least for Black people, we're almost achieving parity. But when you look at the bottom row, out of every 100 television writers or television feature film writers, only 4 are Black. So progress, yes, in my opinion, certainly not enough. And it's showing 4 for Black. Again, if you look at Latino, Asian Pacific Islander, Indigenous people, that number might rise to 5 if we're lucky. But my little ray of hope is the next slide, Jordan. And that kind of shows that where there are people of color, and this certainly applies to women definitely, in leadership positions as writers, directors, and producers, we will hire other writers, directors, producers, and actors who are people of color and women. So where I go, I try to advocate for other people. It's interesting, 2 of the last projects that I've been developing have Asian female leads. I've done 2 projects, Mr. Iglesias on Netflix, and another pilot with primarily Latino casts and writers. So where there is representation, we have to encourage it, support it, and vote with our influence to make sure it continues. So I do have hope for the future. It is better, but I think we still have quite a ways to go, definitely behind the scenes.
Okay. So one of the questions I have for you, Jacque, is I know that you, and I think you sort of touched on this, the opportunities, the fact that streaming has created so much more opportunities. It really does create opportunities for entry as well. In other words, do you need more talent, and is that a way to get people into the pipeline?
It's interesting, when I started, I mean, in terms of industry consolidation, still most of the streamers are owned by a set number of companies. So that presents a barrier to entry and a barrier to growth for people in the industry. However, in terms of talent, and I was talking to a group of students last week, undergrads out here at Cal State Northridge. And so many of them had already written, produced, and acted in their own TikTok videos, their own YouTube series, their own, they're really doing it themselves. They're not limiting themselves to being one thing, just a writer, just a director, just an actor, a performer. And as the need for content grows, I think the major studios and minor outlets are looking to those resources, not just people who are formally trained, people who come up through a corporate system, but they're looking outside to find content pretty much everywhere. And I think that will, that sort of levels the playing field in a way that it never has been before.
So Els, I think that's a natural transition to you at the college level. Have you seen sort of a greater diversity of talent over the years that you've been at USC and how is that reflected, a change in sort of the voices that get presented?
Well, I think there's been certainly in the last several years a push for us to diversify, and that's coming largely from the students. I mean, when I look at our faculty breakdown, we're something like 75% white, and the curriculum unfortunately reflects a lot of that. We're working currently to decolonize the theatrical canon and decenter the works and perspectives of European and white cisgendered males. And so the students are calling for that. And it's, but to Jackie's point about the content creation, I think the students have really, really blossomed through the course of this pandemic in finding their voices and developing their skills and getting themselves out into the world.
So Boomie, I want to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Nope, I'm done.
Okay. So a little bit of lag there, so I apologize. Boomie, I want to bring you in terms of, by the time they get to college, we've sort of self-selected. People are either already interested in the arts, and I wonder, as someone who's running a theater company, how do you try to make efforts to, especially for young people, bring in a diverse audience, and how do you balance that against the classic canon? Like, my community theater could do The Music Man or South Pacific of the classics, and we'll sell out, and we try and do something more recent, more cutting edge, and we won't sell tickets. So how do you balance your fiscal responsibilities with or trying to bring in a broader audience?
So the Hamner Theater, which is named for Earl Hamner, who created the Waltons through no fault of his own, started in Nelson County, which is a rural county, huge county, small population. We started doing mostly new works and trying to tell stories of the community. And so some of our work was literally biographical adaptations, or we did take the Homecoming, which was the piece that turned Earl Hamner's Waltons into the Waltons, and did our own adaptation. We would adapt it every year based on the actors that were available. The interesting thing about the Homecoming is that there is one part for a Black man in it, and it is one of the most crucial parts in the whole play. And it's the Reverend Dooley, and Clayboy shows up Christmas Eve looking for his father, and he throws open the doors of the church and sees a Black congregation celebrating Christmas, and afterwards says to the priest, "I didn't expect to find you here." And Reverend Dooley says to him, "Well, what did you expect to find? We all celebrate Christmas together." And it was Clayboy's enlightenment that, wow, Black people are like white people because we share a lot of the same things. Anyway, that was a really important piece of that play for me. And then we left that venue, and we are now we have no venue. So we do touring productions. So we take them to people. We tour, we do a Shakespeare tour. We go into public places. We try to find audiences that do not have access, and we don't force it on them. We just have it there. So if they want to see it, they can come see it. And of course, what has happened with Zoom is that what we have put on Zoom now reaches a nationwide audience, which is unthinkable in the olden days before that kind of possibility. So our audiences are growing because of that possibility. The other thing that happened was, I don't know if you are all familiar with We See You White American Theater, which was a letter written to the professional commercial white American theater, really, but it trickled down to all the communities. And it basically said, we have been denied access. We are not treated fairly. We are not treated equally. What Jackie was saying about the dots, I mean, the dots were so uneven in the theater world in terms of directors, producers, writers, not so much actors, especially when Hamilton happened. It was like everybody could check that box. Oh, we have a diverse show. So we did have a board, but I said, we can't do this the way boards are typically structured. The hierarchy isn't serving us, and it's not serving our mission, and it's not serving our audience. So I reorganized the board and brought on artists who could spearhead projects. And we started doing this thing called the Newtown Project. We started in 2018 because one of my board members, who's a playwright named Royal Cherie, said, where's the diversity in the community? We're telling the stories of the community. Where's the diversity? She's a Black woman, artist, playwright, actress, director. And I said, you know, Royal, what's really interesting is that Crozet, which is where our studio space is in a designated growth area, which means that all of the affordable housing is being pushed away, because designated growth means you want to bring in all of those people who can afford to buy $300,000 starter homes. Well, most people who work the kind of jobs that were in Crozet were not people who could afford those kinds of houses. And so the population was shifting. And I knew that there was an African-American community in the Afton Greenwood area. And I don't know if any of you is familiar with Virginia, but there's a place called Swananoa, which was this country house for the family that lived in Maymont in Richmond, and they would go summer there. There's a house called Mirador, which is where Mary Astor lived. And so all of these huge estates, which some of which used to be plantations, had become these wealthy estates. And that whole area was called the Playground of the Wealthy in this historical document. There was a once thriving African-American community called Newtown. And we started to investigate that and discovered that there had been a chemical plant built there in 1937, not in Newtown, but immediately adjacent to it. And that over the years, it had been the site of fires and toxic spills, and it was on everybody's radar as a place to avoid. And in 1985, that's not that long ago, there was an explosion, and the 4 men who were working there caught on fire. They all died. There were all sorts of newspaper accounts, and basically the white landowners in the area had the EPA designated a Superfund site because their water was compromised. So the other piece of fallout was that the community of Newtown was annihilated, and the people who lived there got sick. They couldn't stay. There was a woman named Janet Sims who was quoted as, she put wet sheets on the men who were burning in order to try to stop the fire. And she developed sarcoidosis, which is known as the minority lung disease, which is an inflammation of, and I'm going to get it wrong, I'm not a doctor, but it does affect disproportionately Black and brown people. So as we dug into what is Newtown, what happened to this community, there were so many parallels with other sort of environmental injustice situations and medical racism and all of these things. And so we've really embraced this project as a way to literally unearth the history that is buried in the ground in that geographical area, which nobody who lives there knows about because nobody talked about it. So our audiences are the people in the community, really. We're trying to, and this whole idea of interpreting history through the present and how do we present it and whose voices are represented, and all of that is playing into this project. So I didn't answer your question at all because we don't do the kind of audience development that you're talking about because we don't have that kind of a structure. Theater, and after every performance, we have a community conversation. And part of what we're trying to do is to engage the audience on a community level so that they feel ownership and like it's for them and about them, because as David Henry Wang says, theater started in community. It's storytelling. It's what is my connection to this? So.
Hey, Boomie, and Mike, can I just add on that we had a similar project at USC that was called Sacrifice Zone LA that talked about the oil rigs that are right around the campus where, we're in South Central Los Angeles, and there are oil rigs that are sort of hidden around in the town, in the neighborhood around USC. And one of our playwriting faculty, Paula Sismar, joined together with some cinema faculty, and they wrote an Arts in Action grant to explore this topic. And so we did that and had, designers and actors telling the stories of the neighbors around in the neighborhood. And it was very, very powerful. And as an example of the kind of ways that our students are excited about the work of showing inequity. And the other thing I wanted to say is, about the Hamilton thing, I think the most heartbreaking thing I read was this blog by James Daniel, what is his last name? Belnavis, who I'm going to put it in the chat. And it goes to the point that Jacque was talking about, that that what we need is much more diversity in the positions of the people who control what happens to a show. This young man had, got into the first touring company of Hamilton, was very, very excited, but was completely marginalized throughout the process. Because, as he said, all of there was not a single person of color as a musical director in any of the companies across the country. The stage management team, he just felt he was supposed to, he covered 3 of the roles, George Washington, I can't remember the other 2. And he kept being told that he would be able to be considered when those roles were being recast, as happens on tours. And it just didn't happen. So this blog that he wrote is just really heartbreaking. And for me, it was like, shit, if Hamilton can't get it right, what hope do the rest of us have to getting this right? So
Kathie, I want to bring you in, sort of transitioning from something that Boomie was talking about and else as well, in terms of, art as a reflection of the community as a whole. In theater, we're trying to tell or retell, some of these things are telling for the first time neglected stories of people who have been marginalized in the past, or in the case of like Hamilton, retelling it from a different perspective, which is something I tried to do in my own play, where the story of the Lincolns is being told not by the Lincolns, but the narration and the observers, an African-American woman who's in the White House. But you have to look and see, how your own town has reflected its own history and or its values based on its public art. So can you talk a little bit about that and how you evaluate that?
No, absolutely. So it's interesting. So Westport, Connecticut is kind of known as a somewhat, or at least it was known as a progressive community. I mean, now it's a little bit more of a finance heavy environment. But it took a lot of very interesting people from many different cultures, religions, backgrounds, that formed this town, and reshaped it in the early 1900s. And in the 1960s, mid 1960s, we created there was a public art collection that was started for our town, in which major works of art were donated to the community, and the purpose of it was to have original fine art in our school buildings, and to be surrounded by our community members. In the same way that books would be in their hands, that live music would be presented to them on a theater stage, that theater would be also, a live theater would be an option for them, so that original works of art would be as accessible to our young people and our residents as all of these other forms of performance. And the collection, although it was started in the 60s, it had a foundation that went back to public art at the turn of the century with commemorative monuments, and then also the WPA. But also at that time, there were major American artists that were moving here and they were working. So the work of art, and I kind of go back to one of the earlier sessions on race and diversity, and I go back to Linda Jenkins' comments about how do books reflect what the community is hearing, whose history is it? And the same thing really goes for artworks, for visual representations of that history. And do you want me to share some slides right now?
Yeah, if
Mike?
you
Okay.
want, sure.
Yeah, I will. So I have actually a quite serious situation that is really hasn't been out to the public, but we're about to bring this forward. And I thought I would entrust you all as my classmates to kind of talk about this and get some feedback, because I think it really directly impacts and affects what we're talking about today. So I'm going to share my screen. So we have a theater, and this was a theater that was created in 1936, and it was in a school that was built 10 years earlier. This school was at the time a junior high school, but it was really the community theater space for the town. It's where the community theater performed, it's where the community band performed, it's where the Board of Ed meetings were held. And it was a space that artists from the area gathered. And the walls that flanked the proscenium arch were blank. And in 1934, John Stuart Curry, who was an American regionalist painter, or to be a well-known American regionalist painter, was commissioned privately by the town to create murals for this space. On the left and the right, you'll see images from popular theater, from vaudeville, from film, from the circus. And they were, one is called tragedy and the other is called comedy. You see Mickey Mouse, you see cartoons, you see Will Rogers, you see Hamlet, you see, their artists. It's an amazing amalgamation of different images. But what you also see are images of racial stereotyping. You have Uncle Tom sitting at the bedside of little Eva. On the right, you see representations of Amos and Andy from just after their first movie called Double Checker was produced. You also have a representation of I think a Harlem Renaissance theater performance. And this is the one reference of an unidentified female trumpeter up in the right. But really what has been scrutinized is the interpretation of Uncle Tom and of Amos and Andy. Both of these mural vignettes are based on an actual drawing and by a male, African-American male model. But it brings up a lot of issues. These are now in a elementary school auditorium. And there's the question of the art historical question of how works and the view of American culture was presented in 1934, but what is relevant today in 2021. And these are both considered, racial interpretations of Black culture. And so, for a K through 5 world, what does that say about our community? What does it say about our world? What does it say about our society? And we are really trying to put together a program and a proactive approach to address this. But I think it is part of this same narrative of books one reads and the windows and mirrors onto culture for how art can impact this. And because these are in an auditorium space where children take their music lessons, where families gather to engage in their own elementary school performances or class assemblies during the year, what they see on these in these murals can really impact their their own systemic racism that they may not even be aware of. Sadly, the issues that we're faced with is that these are frescoes. They are permanently embedded in the walls. They can't be moved. They're also by a very famous artist. They are very valuable. Not to say that the value of the piece changes anything, but it's like, how do you use, what is that visual representation? And the fact that they're on a stage presents them in a whole nother context of their reality to some people. And it's not just the staff. It's not just the children that we're worried about. It's also the staff, not only the teachers, but the other support staff that work in the building. What is the impact of that? And how do we interpret it? We have been working and talking with another Princetonian, Adina Spigarn, who graduated in 2003, and she wrote a book on the legacy of Uncle Tom's imagery when she was in her doctorate program at Harvard, and worked with Skip Gates on that. And she has been someone who's advocated for not necessarily covering them or and much less destroying them, but how do you build a curriculum to support that, or a artistic representation, or even a modern dramatic presentation to respond to what those images are. So I just kind of put that out there. But I'd love to hear feedback or thoughts, or how, and as part of this larger conversation of representation and portrayals in our culture.
And I think in discussing that in particular, and also more broadly, what do people, and I'd sort of like to open it up to the group, are there moments or occasions where presenting obviously dated or what we would now consider inappropriate material in the arts or in the fine arts, and using that as a deliberate occasion to educate or is it better sort of ignoring, Els, you talked about changing the canon and not just engaging, the classic white directors.
Yeah, I would love to jump in, because we just did a production of a play called The White Plague, which was written by Karel Čapek, a Czech writer, in 1937, as Hitler was advancing across the United States, across Europe. And the play begins, it takes place in a time where there's a huge pandemic. It addresses, at the beginning of the play, there's 3 lepers who are basically the chorus of the play, and they're all suffering from these lesions, and they actually refer to it as the peaking leprosy in the course of this opening 8-10 minutes of the play. The play then goes on to show us the clinic where these patients are being treated. There is no cure, and along comes a doctor who has the cure but will not provide it unless the war and the rising nationalism is stopped. And so the play, it talks about the inequities of treatment for poorer people and richer people, for more powerful people who are involved in the munitions and creating the munitions to support this sort of war-hungry spirit in the country. It's very, very timely play, but the week before we opened, the events in Atlanta happened, and we suddenly had to really address how are students who have been traumatized by recent events in society, how are they going to deal with seeing this play where the Beijing, we changed it from Peking to Beijing leprosy is thrown around, and we ended up addressing it through a note. We ended up having a post-play discussion where people could come and talk, and I felt really strongly that we shouldn't cut those lines because I didn't want to censor ourselves, though the material is sensitive. And I think as people saw the play and took it in, and the play, it's just very, very powerful, having experienced the events of January 6th as well. So I think it's helpful to see the material, but also to talk about it. And I don't know, looking back now, if we would have made different choices had we been able to, but a lot of the material that we presented was pre-recorded, so we couldn't really change it at the last minute. Yeah, Karl Čapek also wrote Roar, and he wrote the insect play. He was very, very advanced. He created actually the term for robots. So.
Interesting.
I think it is important to be proactive in these situations versus reactive, and as much as you can plan. One of the other, we've been talking to the University of Indiana, in which there was a series of murals by Benton, and they portrayed a history of Indiana culture, but there was one image that became under scrutiny after the Charlottesville protest, and they found themselves the day after with a change.org petition to remove an image that one of the panels that had a young African-American girl in a hospital bed, and behind them were Ku Klux Klan imagery. And, and it wasn't, and if you looked at it in an isolated situation, you would think that, yes, that needed to come down. But actually Benton's larger message was one of, was an anti-slavery, anti-Klan message. And if you only understood it through the narrative of the whole story versus the one scene, right? And so they ended up keeping the mural, all the components up, but they deactivated that space as a classroom so that it wouldn't be something that was present for other people. But I think art and theater and storytelling are all, there's a lot of symbiosis between it, and the different acts, the different scenes, and the different sections. And if you take them out of context, sometimes they're not fully understood.
Kathie, the murals you're talking about have a lot in common with the monuments and the argument about monuments and what to do with them. And since I am in Charlottesville and essentially spent a lot of time in Richmond, I've been sort of surrounded by all of this. And so after George Floyd, the big monument in Richmond became a place of art. And it was, I don't know if you've seen the hologram.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
I mean, so what a way to sort of transform a place of trauma and horror to something that people can look at and sort of see in a different light, quite literally. But the monuments are gone. I mean, they've been gone, taken away. Although there is the DAR is fighting to have some of the ones on Monument Avenue retained. And interestingly enough, many homeowners on Monument Avenue are fighting the removal of the statues because they feel that it will bring down their home value. So, I mean, it's like, how do you put those things together? I mean, it's kind of like you say those works of art are really valuable, but what is the real cost, right? That's something
I agree.
we also have to, but it's like, there's so much in common with that. And it's interesting that I spent all of yesterday at the Southeastern Theater Conference Symposium virtually. And one of the things that came up was that theater is now becoming, because of Zoom in many ways, performance art, where all of these different media are working together and being transmitted out to way broader audiences because of the possibility of the virtual world. And so everything becomes performative in a way, right? So what happens at the monument is performance. What happens with those murals? Anyway, it's just really interesting how all of the disciplines seem to be morphing into a more holistic art form.
And I did want to mention, I was listening to NPR today, and just, I believe today, there is a new exhibit in Louisville at the Louisville Art Museum, which is an exhibit on Breonna Taylor that was put together with a whole community group. If you go to NPR's webpage, you can find the story today. I tried to copy and paste the link, but my skills aren't good enough while I'm moderating as well. But it was fascinating because it really talked about how the art museum itself made some very deliberate choices in putting this exhibit together, one of which was to put the exhibit in the main exhibit space in the hall where only white artists had ever been displayed, like, you know, the biggest names, etc. And they wanted to make sure that this space was given totally over to the issue of Breonna Taylor. The family was involved, the community was involved. It's all African American artists. It's about, and it's basically there's three parts to it. And I just thought it was fascinating, but to me, it was a way of art trying to act as an educator and a healer and an exposer, quite frankly, of our flaws. Jacque, I want to come back to you a little bit and just ask you, now, I don't know if anybody else watches Unicorn. I'll tell you I'm a big fan of the show. And if for those of you who don't know the show, the main character is a widower with two young women, girls that he's trying to raise. And his best friends are, he's white, there's another white family, and then there's an African American family. And I'm wondering, Jacque, if, you know, there were deliberate choices in having that kind of diverse cast. And, you know, one thing that struck me is, you know, these sort of natural relationships that all three of them have. And if I'm not mistaken, it takes place in North Carolina. So, you know, were those some deliberate choices that the cast made to have a racially balanced cast where these people seem to have very close, comfortable relationships? And then I want to talk about one particular episode where obviously you addressed racial issues in particular.
Yeah, it was certainly a conscious choice. Whenever we do casting, pretty much, unless there's a very specific reason why, it's open. You know, we rarely say we need a person of a certain ethnicity. But in constructing the show, and I wasn't there for that, but what I understand is that the reason that these three families became friends is they all have a 12-year-old daughter, and the 12-year-old daughters met and the moms met in like Mommy and Me or something like that. And, you know, and the dads came along and they became best friends, and the wives became best friends, and the kids, you know, are growing up together. And then one mom passed away and the other two families, you know, embraced the widower in this circle of love. And I know the episode you're going to refer to, because I think almost, I don't want to say consciously, but just in, we didn't think as we were establishing these families and their relationship that the fact that they were of a different race was, that one family was an issue, kind of until it became one. And
I was about to say until it became one. So do you want to describe the?
Yeah.
Because I thought it was handled really very well.
Yeah, and it came from the other Black writer on the show who does have a young son. And the episode, one of the white dads is coming to a birthday party, and he gives the little Black boy, his friend's Black son, a squirt gun. And his dad immediately takes it away from him because it's not safe for a young Black boy to run around the streets with anything that looks like a gun. And again, it's something that the white parents had never thought about. It was something that the Black parents had already had this discussion with their son. And so it created, you know, a family sitcom dilemma. And how do you take a toy away from your kid that you just gave him? But the larger discussion among the adults was, you know, for the first time, I think the other white friends had to reckon with the fact that their Black friend was living in the same block, in the same world, in the same school, but was living a different existence than they were. You know, that they're, you know, they talk about the fact that, you know, he's paranoid about leaving his house without his wallet, or he doesn't like to go on walks at night, you know, things that they just do because, you know, they're just living in America, but he's living in a different America, even though he's in their lives, in their world every day, and they have to sort of cope with that. And, you know, we tried to address it lightly, and, you know, it had some definitely funny moments as, you know, the couple thinks that they're the woke couple, realizes that maybe they're not. But yeah, I think, you know, we want to, on that show, whether it's about grief, whether it's about friendship, whether it's about race, just really deal with issues as they arise. And yeah, there have been things that we wanted to do, like that small things, like have one of the kids wear a Black Lives Matter t-shirt, which he definitely would have coming out of the past 2 years, but didn't want it to be an issue. So I was for it. Other people were against it. I don't think it happened, but you know, those sorts of things that are daily lives of our characters, we like to eliminate. And having opened that door, I think going forward, we'll be able to, again, find natural, honest ways to address the differences in their lives.
And actually, one of the things that you just said is what struck me so much about the episode was it was very natural. It didn't seem terribly, you know, pedantic. It wasn't the sole focus of the episode. It just sort of was part of the national, you know, it was Noah's birthday. And, you know, Wayne thought he was giving him something fun to play with. And, you know, it just the way it kind of unraveled felt very natural, not preachy. And I think, you know, that's one of the great things about really good art, I think, and especially theater art, is it just becomes part of the fabric of the conversation without feeling forced. And I have to commend you, because I thought that episode you did, like, it really was a remarkable job. I guess the question for everybody too is, you know, to what extent do you feel as producers and writers and developers of talent and art to, you know, promote social justice themes and make that an inherent part of your mission? Anybody want to speak to that?
Well, I'll just mention, you know, I mean, our references in this mural to Uncle Tom are also references to the stage portrayal and the film portrayals of the character. And that novel was also written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in Connecticut. And the Harriet Beecher Stowe Museum, which used to be a historic house museum, has actually transformed itself in the past 10 to 15 years into a center of social justice. That is exactly what they do. They are not trying to make it, you know, an abolitionist, you know, time period piece. They're in the center of Hartford. They live, the house is right next door to the Mark Twain house. And they use it just for that. And they reach out to the Hartford community, which is significantly more diverse than Westport is. But it's part of the larger mission for Connecticut state history. And they've been very, very successful at it. So we've been talking to them as well, but I think they're a really great example of how you take something that may be dusty and old and make it relevant and continue making it relevant today, and bearing the truth of it, bearing the truth of the original novel, and using it to talk about things that are uncomfortable and hard, and anyway.
It's interesting. I see my friend George Buston and Fran McNeil and I are all on the Princeton Prize in Race Relations. And I don't know if this is true, George, in some of the applications you read, but certainly Franny and I in Philadelphia saw a big trend this year in students advocating for curriculum change to make sure in English classes that more stories and diverse voices are told. that they're demanding classes in African American history, that they're demanding more integration from diverse voices in virtually everything across the curriculum. And so it's interesting that there's this clear push from youth to do that. I guess, Els, do you see that among your students, that even at the college level, has there been that sort of, push to diversify the curriculum and bring those voices? And you alluded to that a
definitely.
little bit before.
Very much so. The School of Dramatic Arts just opened their Office of Equity and Diversity, and they have an Equity and Diversity Action Plan, which is sort of 8 pillars. I think that it involves curriculum change. It involves casting changes, which we enacted this spring. And I think the students were very happy about them. And it involves accountability. And I just wanted to speak about that, the word uncomfortable that Kathie used a minute ago. I've been on a journey this year with a group of, I would say probably primarily white production managers forum, and they have an EDI committee, and we've been doing a lot of self-education and talking, and it's been very, very powerful process. There was a particularly wonderful podcast that was given by that was part of an art equity group, which is Carmen Morgan and Michael Robertson are the director and deputy director, and they had a roundtable conversation with 2 white theater practitioners, one Marilee Barrera, who's the costume head up at Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and S.K. Katsakas, I'm not getting her name right, who's at Cal Shakes. And it was just a very powerful conversation about how we can make a difference as people in white administrations and in various theaters, how we can have an impact. And one of the most powerful things was Marilee talked about in hiring people. We're all trying to broaden and diversify our staffs and bring more people into the staff in my school. For sure, we had 3 openings this year, and we're really making an effort to diversify. But she talked about making sure in the interview process that people are not fragile, right? And having really, specific conversations about how people are dealing with their white fragility, because it is uncomfortable, right? It's very uncomfortable. In fact, I was sitting here thinking, why am I on this panel tonight? I feel like I'm the worst person to be on this panel. But, I think we're really, we have to do this work. It's uncomfortable, but it's not unsafe, and it makes a huge difference. So I think, and the accountability factor is really, really critical. And I feel fortunate to work with a lot of faculty members we're working to hold each other accountable in the work that we do and in the environment that we create for our students, so that everyone is having an equitable experience, and that we're, improving.
One thing we talked about a little bit earlier was how technology has been a little bit of a leveler. And I think in our planning call, I think, Boomie, you were the one who mentioned the fact that, one of the things we see is sort of big commercial theater may be not as good a laboratory for diversity, that actually, more experimental theater and community theaters that are really not necessarily, they don't have the investor component where you got to make a buck, that they're more willing and able, and historically have been more willing and able to be daring, be more inclusive, etc. And I don't know if anybody wants to.
Well, can I just say
that.
something about that?
Yeah.
So in Charlottesville, which is Charlottesville, where all of that unrest happened, the supporters, there's a series of theaters. There are a bunch of theaters. There's the UVA theater, which is its own universe. Charlottesville is an incredibly segregated town across the board. So like the university is its own world, and the community is its own world, and the Black population lives in one place, and it's a very weird place. And it's also very complacent. And the people that are the supporters of live arts, which is the major community theater in the area, are, I'd say, 99.9% white. And so it's very difficult to attract a diverse audience because the offerings are catering to the white sponsors and subscribers. And they really don't necessarily, they'll to have the one Black show a year or whatever it is, but they don't really want to change anything. And that is a huge issue, especially when you're talking about funding, because who are you satisfying? Are you satisfying the people who are paying for it, or are you trying to actually be inclusive and diverse? So some years ago, I started something called the Central Virginia Theater Alliance, which I mentioned to you, Mike, I think, which was basically for the area theaters to collaborate so that they weren't all casting big musicals at the same time. So they could support each other, and so that they could grow audiences together, because the more audience there is for theater, the more all of us would benefit. It sort of collapsed when the major theater live arts decided it was all about co-opetition instead of collaboration, and took all the performing arts dollars, right? After the events of, after George Floyd and the We See You White American Theater and the pandemic and all of that, and all the theaters didn't know what to do, we restarted the CVTA, and we decided that we would be an alliance of anti-racist theater that the CVTA would be anti-racist. We would be a coalition of theater organizations working to combat racism in the community. And one of the things that, so we did some trainings together, which was very helpful. David Campt, one of our classmates, came and actually did a training with us, which was fabulous. There was very little follow-up, which is disappointing. But there was a panel discussion. There are 4 artists of color on the CVTA, and one of them said to the rest of us white theater makers, have you ever talked to the people of color in the community about their experience? And so we invited them to do a panel, and what they did was they got stories from community members, they wrote them into monologues, they distributed them anonymously, so they were not the people to whom those experiences had happened, they were simply telling the stories. And the amount of microaggression, of like overtly racist actions that nobody paid attention to, it was staggering. And then you wonder why the actors of color aren't knocking the doors down to come participate in these things. It's not rocket science, as I said to you. And there's actually a Black theater company in Charlottesville now called the Charlottesville Players Guild, which once upon a time, when Lane School was, this was back in the 60s, I think, there was a very active Black theater company called the Charlottesville Players Guild. It died, and a woman started it again. And so they are doing all of August Wilson's plays. They do, this year is all original plays by local playwrights of color, which is awesome. But still, there's this sense of division, which, how do you heal that? Well, I think you start by listening, not talking, to the stories that are being told about what is going on, and try to change the systems within your theaters in order to, what did my friend say, the oblong the box, we're all in these boxes, oblong the box, let more people have access to it. When somebody comes to the table, it's not about do it the way we're doing it, it's we're stepping aside, how would you do? I mean, it's all about more voices at the table, but it takes, the CVTA is going to have to work as an organization to get the Charlottesville and Central Virginia theater area on board. It's not easy. And a lot of it has to do with the fucking money. I'm sorry, pardon my French, but it's capitalism. That's all it is. So we change the systems of money and start paying the artists instead of supporting the buildings, then suddenly we're talking about something. So that's what I'm saying.
I guess we sort of alluded to this a little bit earlier, and I want to come back to something specific that I struggled with a little bit, in my own writing, which is it, if and when it's appropriate to have a non-minority person create a minority character and speak in that voice? You know, and when is that okay, and when does that cross the line into cultural appropriation? Because I think I mentioned, you know, the narrator of my play is an African American woman. Now, it's a historical character from the 19th century. I had the advantage of, she actually wrote an autobiography, so much of what we have in her narration is actually her voice. But still, there was always a little part of me that felt like it was incredibly arrogant for me to feel that I could write her part at all. And yet we really thought it was important for an observer who was in the room, but not, you know, in the room where it happened, but not of the room where it happened. And I wrote this before Hamilton, but you know, we really thought that perspective, rather than just creating this historical presentation of Lincoln, we want to show every time he made a move, the effect it had on, or the potential effect it had on this woman. So anybody want to speak to, you know, the issue of, you know, obviously minority playwrights, there might be occasions to write for white characters and vice versa, but is there a point where it becomes inappropriate?
I just think, you know, obviously if I didn't write for people of all ethnicities, I would not have a job. But, you know, when I've approached lead characters in particular, like I said, I've done a couple of projects with Latinx cast and now with Asian American. You know, I do it in collaboration. You know, it's just, I just ask. You know, am I getting this right? Is there anything wrong with what I'm saying? How would this person react in this situation? You know, and that doesn't mean I have to, you know, start with them over my shoulder, but when I'm at a point where I'm comfortable sharing it, then I definitely want input. And I've been, I did a pilot years ago. It was about a Latina singing group, and a very famous director, Latin director, looked at it and said he didn't want to do it. And I was like, oh, okay. He didn't give me any specifics. At the same time, when we cast it, one of the actors, who was a veteran Latino actor, said that it was the most sensitive portrayal he'd ever seen. And then included by Latinx, you know, so it can be somewhat subjective, but you know, you just always, and coming from TV where everything is a collaboration, I just encourage everybody to, you know, look outside yourself. You have a source document, which is amazing. And then you can go from there with someone who might have a better or a different, maybe not better, but at least a different perspective that could inform your work.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, in our case, we did lots of stage readings beforehand. And so we were able to get that input from the African American woman who played the character in the stage readings. And then after we cast it for the actual show, that actor did come to us and say there are a couple lines that made her feel uncomfortable for whatever reason. Could we change them? And we worked together to, you know, make it seem, it wasn't even uncomfortable. They didn't ring true, I guess.
Right.
Which is hard when you're in a historical piece. It might not ring true because it's not contemporary, but, you know, she was able to give us the input of how to change those lines to make them seem both more true and less preachy. I do want to open up. I know Mike Frischilla had his hand raised ages ago, and we've been talking a lot. So I do want to actually open it up to questions, comments, input from other folks. So I think, Mike, you're the first person who had his hand up. So.
And Mike, before you unmute yourself, just if anybody else has a question, please raise your hand. If you don't know how to do it, there should be a little place under, if you open up the participants side panel, towards the bottom, there should be a place that allows you to raise your hand. So that would be great. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, it's interesting because prior to the start of the presentation, I think Jordan and John Mosler and I were talking, and we talked about the business of art briefly, and then it came up in this discussion, and I think the business is an important part. So I had two questions relating to that, and I hope I can get them out in a coherent manner. The first is talking about the colleges involved. I mean, a lot of the stuff regarding the theater arts or the visual arts or the film arts is there. It's not necessarily Harvard or Yale or Princeton, but schools like NYU or USC or UCLA, are they doing a tracking and outreach to see how many more people they're bringing in of minority representation? Because you can't have more if you're not getting more in. So that would be my first question is how is that project working within the educational system of the colleges? And the second question is the Hollywood is a very lazy business, and I don't mean that as disrespect. I've known people that have worked in the business for a while, but they tend to glom on to certain things. For example, Harvard Lampoon hosted a whole slew of writers that came in. Second City brings a whole slew of actors in, or SNL brings a whole slew of writers and actors in. Is Hollywood being pushed to work and find these creative outlets that might outside of the comedy clubs? Are they working to find talented people to write and perform within the film arts? And those are the two points when you can't make the business better if you don't get more people out to where the people are. So hopefully somebody can comment on those two.
Yeah, I can answer your first question. I teach occasionally at USC, and this year was my first year on the admissions committee for the MFA program and the writing program. And over half of our admits were people of color. So
excellent.
And I was surprised, I was honestly, frankly surprised. But I've been there maybe on and off for about 5 years. And they've made that a real focus.
I would say that
was very, very heartened to see that. I think that we just got our the actual acceptance deadline is the 15th, so we're close to final numbers, but both applicants and admissions were more than 60% female and about half people of color.
That sounds great to me, because it seems to me that it sends a signal that there is an opportunity. If you're not going to attract people if they don't think there's an opportunity. So it sounds like that's what you're saying, and that's a great thing to hear.
Yeah.
But I'm really happy to hear you say that, Jackie, because my experience at USC is that the data has not been available to us about who is applying. And I think there's only recently been a sort of a push to disaggregate that data so that we can know what we're doing, right? So I'm really pleased to hear you say that. I know that our MFA acting program and our writing program are both much more diverse than the undergraduate program. And what we're hearing from our students as they come in is, well, I want faculty members who look like me, who can, who can model the professional life for me. And so I think there's been a big push to bring, much more diversity to the faculty as well.
Yeah, I definitely feel that, like I said, I'm not a full-time member. I only teach every once in a while. But much more heartening than when I first started there in 2016. I think there's been a huge effort to change the perception of the school and who gets, at least in that program, who gets in and why, and to diversify the student body in the arts.
One thing we haven't talked about, which has always been a concern of mine, is funding. In order to have the pipeline for college, of course, you've got to step back to high school and elementary school. And there's been so much cutback of funding for the arts. I mean, my own school district, which is a pretty well-off school district, actually tried to cut back on the amount of time spent on the arts, not because of funding, because it's a well-funded school district, but because they felt like there wasn't enough time to devote to all the learning that needed to be done for all the freaking standardized testing that has been imposed on the school district. And so they wanted to cut out, basically 15 minutes of art and 15 minutes of music and 15 minutes of instrumental and all sorts of things across the board. And, I was one of the parents who led the charge against that. And we actually showed that a lot of their assumptions were false. But I'm just wondering if other people have experienced that in here, and how much do we have to be advocates to make sure that that doesn't happen in our communities, and especially, our communities of color that, Philadelphia school districts just struggles for every penny. Anybody want to? Maybe I'm preaching and not asking.
No, you're absolutely right, Mike. We did Pipeline by Dominic Morisseau this spring, and we invited, the director had sort of, when the play is done live, it incorporates the audience as the classroom, right? And so this young teacher who's dealing with her son who's in crisis, she's talking directly to the audience. And so Larry Powell directed this production, and we were doing it virtually. So he wanted the teacher to be teaching in a Zoom classroom. So he reached out to a group of middle school students at the Amazing Grace Conservatory there in Los Angeles that he had attended as a young man. And we created a classroom with these students, and we pre-filmed their participation, and it was just amazing. And I do agree that we just don't have nearly enough emphasis on the arts and humanities in the middle schools. I watched recently a show on Netflix called The Creative Brain, and it talks about a school in, I think it's Vermont or New Hampshire, where they teach every subject through the lens of the arts. They're teaching math through painting and, with angles. And I mean, it was really, really exciting. And I think that is hopefully a trend that we'll see other schools pick up. It's really, really important.
Both of my kids went through it. It's just 1 year, but in middle school, our school has a program called Artifacts, which is very similar. So everything gets taught through an artistic lens. But, it's 1 year. And I will say, of course, that I couldn't help but notice the racial disparity within that class, and the lack of, not that our schools are that diverse to begin with, but it seemed even more so that this class had, for whatever reason, had amplified the racial disparity of the makeup of our school for whatever reason.
I think what's been happening in our area is that in the larger Fairfield County area has actually been some vibrancy. I mean, our high school, we live in an area that is devoted, in a town that is devoted to the arts. And when those minutes of art and drama and even debate were tried to be cut a few years ago, parents arose, and they weren't. They never have really touched the arts. But I think what's happening is that in our drama programs, they have turned to radio broadcasts. They've been, doing things that are lower tech, and doing a lot of radio productions of dramatic reading or state or script in hand readings and things like that, rather than being on the live stage, things that they could manage with being online and being virtual. And the same thing with music. They've really tried to figure out how to come together and do things on a virtual platform. But Westport aside, the cities of Norwalk and Bridgeport have actually been thriving, and some of the nonprofits that have been set up Neighborhood Studios is one in Bridgeport, and there's a brand new Norwalk Arts Center being opened this June that is going to provide free art support and training to Norwalk kids in not only fine arts, but in music and in performance arts. And that's opening. I mean, it's like so refreshing and so exciting to see things actually, emerging and blooming and living versus it not, because I think arts has been a way that people have had to deal with the past year. We have a local blogger that has been doing a weekly a piece just on arts, and whether it's images of people's art they've turned in, or audio files, or whatever it may be, it's just been a celebration of that as a release, as escape. And I think that it's been a healing moment for our community to come around the arts. So I think it can be there, but
yeah, I guess for me, one of my concerns is that when you take it out of the schools, access and equity become a greater issue. If it becomes an after-school program,
absolutely,
not every parent, has the ability to get the kid there and get the kid back. And one of the initiatives that I really support here is one of our regional theater companies. It's the Arden Theater Company does a program called Arden for All, where they bring the productions into the school, or they bring the actors into the school to talk about the production. Then the kids get to come as a field trip to the class, to the show for free, and meet the actors. And for some of them, it's their first ever experience with live theater. And I think it's great that they go into the school and they've made this a completely free program and it's school oriented. But I do worry about, and I have a family member who runs an arts program in Philadelphia. So I fully support the effort, but I do, she runs into these issues of, I want to have as diverse a group I can, but if my space is not close to public transportation and it's not in a diverse neighborhood, what kids am I going to draw in? And she's tried to be very deliberate about where she opens in order to try to address those issues, but then it's a cost, and she can only give so many scholarships.
Right. And the Westport Country Playhouse, which has been around since 1931, which was originally like a summer theater, but is a very important regional theater. I mean, they normally provide, opportunities for kids, in the neighboring cities to come in for these performances of live theater with incredible actor. But, they've been dark. I mean, they're dark for 2 years. I mean, they're closed and they're not opening. And this is their second season. So, what's happening to the regional theater that can provide these opportunities is a real problem. I mean, it's a real concern coming out of this pandemic, because, here you've got 2 shuttered up seasons. I mean, I don't know how they can get the bandwidth to come back, even with the donors they may have on their board. I mean, I think that's a larger issue of coming out of COVID is, what's going to be there, what's going to be available. Our community theater hasn't started up either.
No, we haven't. I mean, we've been dark for 1.5 years. We can't, we can't bring an audience in, and we don't have the technological prowess to really go online and present something that's of quality. I mean, we shut down mid-production. We were in the second week of a 3-week run. I think the sets and props are still sitting on the stage. It's literally like we weren't allowed back into, we're in borrowed space. So one of the things that I always want to sort of push and ask at all of these sessions is asking the professionals what they think we as Princetonians and classmates can do or should be doing to promote equity in the arts. are there things we can be doing in our own communities, either at the micro level or the macro level? Any suggestions, advice?
Just think talking about it, talking about what we can do to make a difference. That the podcast I referred to earlier, Michael Robertson said when he leaves his apartment every morning, he has a sign on the back of his door and it says, how will racism appear in the spaces that I'm in and how will I be complicit in it? And I found
Wow.
that just so powerful. And actually I pasted it on my door too, though I'm not leaving my house very often. I just think we just constantly have to be looking at our bias and what are we doing that's preventing equity in our spaces. You have a couple of folks with their hands up.
Yep,
Do you see?
yep, Jordan, I was gonna say, do you wanna?
Sure, I think next up is Raj. Just unmute yourself.
Sure. Well, actually, I was going to ask what Mike just asked, but I'll sort of expand on it. I was wondering the same thing. What can we as individuals, as perhaps arts consumers, do differently to sort of help this process? And, through the course of the conversation, I was reflecting on the fact that, well, pre-pandemic, my wife and I would get a subscription to the Berkeley Rep out in the San Francisco Bay Area, which does a fantastic job. But in the context of this, I was like, why are we driving so many times to Berkeley, an hour away, to go to this institution run by some fabulous people, but they're all white? When along the way in Oakland, there must be all sorts of Black theaters, or right here in sort of Silicon Valley, San Jose area, there are theater companies run by Indians and all sorts of others. And so instead of going to Berkeley Rep and sort of seeing the best of our regional rep, maybe we should be really going to these other theater companies. So that was the idea that came to my mind, but I was wondering if other folks have other ideas along those lines.
I know that I'm just one Netflix user, but I don't think this has been a conscious effort, but I've been watching an enormous number of movies and shows written by, directed by, and starring African-American Black actors, writers, and directors. And, if all of us do that and there's a market for it, then people, if you build it, they will come, I guess, to quote a white writer.
To both of those points, in any form of the arts, I don't, you're graciously considering including TV in the arts. Support is 100% of the game. Whether you are, we go to downtown to see theater productions all the time, but you're right, there are smaller theaters, there are regional theaters, there are ethnically based performances that you need to keep your eye out for and support those as generously as you do the major institutions in your town. And if there are any programs that are educating children in the arts, support those as well. That's where the real influence can immediately be felt. A small donation to them, it's nothing to a big institution, but to them, it could help them keep going for another performance. So
there was an article in the New York Times today about just, talking about big organizations, about how the Boston Symphony Orchestra is going to do Tanglewood again this year after a year off. And they think they lost $50 million in the last year and had to cut their budget. So if they're losing $50 million, but they can still go forward, I can only imagine what, places that are shuttered, like, you were talking about, are dealing with.
Can I just say there's something, what you said about driving to Berkeley Rep and passing these other communities, there's so much to be said for investing in the community efforts, not as a solo diet, obviously, but as part of your cultural diet. And the thing, we have gotten so accustomed to being told what we should go see, so that we have sort of abdicated our aesthetic, our taste in favor of a group aesthetic in many ways, like go to Berkeley Rep because it's the best of the best. But the little small community, messy, less neat, non-status quo productions and art events are sometimes the most exciting, and it's more likely that you will engage in conversation with the artists, with other community members, and that's how we start to make change, is by talking and listening. And that's much harder at Berkeley Rep, I would venture to say. But so shop local, that's what I have to say.
Also, I think there's every theater now has or should have some kind of diversity statement, and I think you can certainly look at the menu before you choose your entree, right? And if you don't see a statement and you don't see that they're having the conversation within their organization, then take the vegetarian
Question
option.
why? Yeah. It's interesting what Boomie, what you were saying is, I subscribe to I can't remember the name of it, but it's basically a submission tally for playwrights, right? So every month they put out, here are places that are calling for scripts of different kinds and things like that. And it's really fascinating because if you look, the big companies, first of all, the huge houses aren't taking any unsolicited manuscripts. But if you really parse through it, the people who are asking specifically for scripts from people with color or people with an LGBTQ voice or, a non-traditional voice are all these tiny little theater companies scattered across the country. And it really is like, that's where the edge is. And that's the places that we should really be, $100 makes a difference to them. They may be performing in a tiny little 40 theater space. And I like what you said about, you go to Berkeley House, you're sitting next to somebody else who just paid $100 a ticket. Like you're going to all run out afterwards to, get to the parking lot, be the first one there. Whereas you go to these smaller houses that I do both, but those are the places where after the show, you're sitting around saying, wow, that was really interesting. They're also more likely to actually have talkbacks, after the show or before the show, and those opportunities to me are so enriching and so important. One of the things I love.
But so it's really interesting. Sometimes your reaction is, God, that was terrible. And that's an okay opinion to have. And isn't it more healthy to go, I didn't like that. What were you trying to do? Because it didn't appear. I mean, I think that's a worthy conversation. And we are so afraid of that conversation. And that's what we expect the critics to do. This is great. This is terrible. But what do we think?
Yeah.
I think that's a really.
Yeah. John, you have your hand up, so you want to unmute?
Hi. First of all, I want to say that I commend everybody that participates in these events and the organizers, Jordan. I think it's so important. And I was just going to say as a general, I did put this link up, Black Art in the Absence of Light. It's an HBO documentary that came out recently, and I'm involved with Art 21 here in New York, and was able to participate in a Zoom with Sam Pollard, who put together the documentary, which starts with David Driscoll. And in 1976, he put together one of the first really prominent, controversial museum exhibitions of Black art in Los Angeles. And this is a fascinating documentary where there's so much education for everybody and understanding and learning. I think a comment for me, I've been quite involved in social justice for 30 years in many regards, and outside of being an artist right now. But I always think in these terms, and particularly now, art is certainly not recession proof. At this level, it's kind of like the 1% thing. It's recession proof, but all the rest of it's not recession proof. And it comes down to, for me, for my part, speaking for myself, small moves. It starts with each of us. And that's, I think it's, when I was at Princeton, I was going to save the world. And I was studying regional integration theory and self-reliance theory, and I was, sports and whatever. And then I came down to New York City and one program in New York City, and just, trying to impact one individual. So that's and one of the other things I was going to just mention in closing is, right now in the current environment, and I think this, for me, permeates everything that we're talking about, is, all right, I've been involved in social justice for 30 years. I don't know what it is about this year, Black Lives Matter, critical, but there are programs right now. There's education that's occurring very specific to educating people that are not of color, not Black or brown, and understanding history, understanding perspective of trying to of Black or brown person, what's happening in this country to those people. And okay, I've been involved in social justice for 30 years. I've been stunned by some of the learning that I've had recently. Whatever moment in time or whatever is motivated. I don't have specific links to that. I will put up the documentary again right now. But they can be found, and I recommend them for all. I don't have to say that to the Black people on this here, but I will say it to I hate to reverse segregate here, but for all the us, there's a certain. I think it was there was a humility that I felt, particularly coming from so much experience of working with youthful offender programs, the Robin Hood Foundation, et cetera, of the amount of learning that I've had this year. And again, that's available for all of us. I hope I didn't offend anybody.
Just looking at my notes, there was only one other thing that I wanted to touch on that we didn't mention, and that's, we shouldn't forget, Jacque obviously represents the writers, producers, etc. But we shouldn't forget that for every production, there are people in the lighting booth, there are people in the sound booth, there are people backstage, there are people, in the pit, although the orchestra pits are getting smaller and smaller. And one of the things that, when we talk about putting people in the arts, we're not just talking about people on the stage or the people with the paintbrush. They are the curators, and they are the people who work in the museums, and they are, so making sure that those voices are diverse, and that those people have opportunities, the set makers, the costume designers, all those people, Els is nodding her head. It literally takes a village to put on a show, and then some, right? Sometimes I think it takes 2 villages to make sure the show comes off without a hitch. And, those people, they're in the trades. I think there's a huge opportunity there for people of color to get increased representation too. Els, you unmuted, so I know you want to say something.
Well, I wanted to go back to Catherine Brokaw's comment in the chat about how much of the undergraduate pipeline in the arts is affected by financial considerations. Duh, it's like the Venn diagram where the kid who's got the talent creatively and got the grades through whatever school system they've come through, and has the financial wherewithal to attend a major university to study theater, it's very slim right now. And I think we need to constantly find ways to raise money for scholarships so that those students can have access to an arts education. And I know in the course of hiring young staff that we're being much more specific about the people that we reach out to. There's a wonderful website that was created by Dee Stewart, he works for Disney now, but he's used to be a production manager, and he's created a production on deck website, which is really, really great and allows you to see artists, designers of color that you can invite to play with you. And he has all sorts of curated lists of people, which is really great. And I know we're searching for a new technical theater manager right now at USC in my department. And, I went to that list and reached out to a lot of the people on that list. So, but yeah, the cost of the education, it's really a barrier.
Still a barrier to entry.
There's to your point about the people behind the scenes and who are the support for the productions. I was watching a panel discussion with an artistic director and a director of marketing and a sign language interpreter, and they were all people of color. And the sign language interpreter said, because he's Black, he only ever gets asked to do interpretation of Black shows. And he said, which means that I basically work during Black History Month when everybody's doing their Black show, or only for those shows that are with predominantly Black people. And he said, sign language is its own language. That's what I speak. Why do I have to be relegated to Black shows? So part of it is about we white people opening our eyes and getting out of our ruts, because we're stuck in this sort of assumption of the status quo bias. It's always been like this, and we don't think about it. And so really challenging our own assumptions on a daily basis. It's like that sign you have on your door, Els. I mean, that's really what we all have to do. But it just, if you don't think about it consciously and decide to do something differently, it's not going to happen. So it really is up to each of us.
And I think with that call to arms, Boomie, I think that's the perfect way. Unless, Jordan, I don't see any other hands up. Am I wrong about that?
Nope.
Anybody want to throw in some last words? No. Clint's got his hand up.
Shoot, go Clint.
Okay. Hey, everybody. My question is a television question, so I'm pointing toward Jackie. Good to see you, Jackie. I recently discovered the brilliance of the TV show Seinfeld, and the reason is because when Fox was just starting out, they had a lineup of a show called New York Undercover, Martin, and Living Single. And New York Undercover, if you're not familiar with it, was about this New York detective of a Black guy who worked with a Puerto Rican guy and a Puerto Rican woman. So this is unheard of at that time frame. And I missed the other NBC stuff that came on Thursday nights. Somehow I was able to watch The Cosby Show. I can't figure that out, but I never saw Seinfeld or Friends. And my question, Jackie, is that with the commercial networks, did you find that some were more conducive to using Black talent? Because I think that Fox basically built their audience with these Black shows. And then all of a sudden they were all gone. I could be wrong about that. You would know more.
So that was definitely a trend in the, I'd say mostly the 90s for new networks to pick a niche audience, which was pretty much Black audience. And once they built up that, once they built success there, they would sort of grow out of it and start programming to a larger audience. It happened with Fox, it then happened with UPN, which became the CW, which then for Black writers, producers, performers, made it a very cyclical job, a cyclical existence, because those shows would go off the air and then everyone would be out of work until someone rediscovered the Black audience. I think hopefully we've grown past that, And there are now a number of networks dedicated to all sorts of specific audiences, as well as the major broadcast networks and streamers, as Jordan was referencing Netflix, they understand the value of particular audience segments and are programming to them, not only because minority audiences per se tend to be more on the cutting edge of culture. And so that's sort of the hip hop place to be when you're starting out or you're trying to grow your audience. But because mainstream audience is more accepting of watching a show that has a predominant, a cast of Asian Americans or Black people.
Okay.
All right, well,
Any last hands going up? I don't see any. I just want to remind everyone about the April 16th deadline for the DEI. I want to make a pitch for that since I was part of the working group that proposed that our class have a DEI officer. So I hope some of you whose faces I'm seeing are considering applying for that job. I think it's an important thing for our class to have. So I'm going to invoke executive privilege to cheerlead for it because a lot of people worked very hard to bring that to the table.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you for that. Thank you to all the panelists for a really interesting discussion. In May, believe it or not, is reunions. And so our programming in May will be around reunions. We are currently planning, and we'll see if we can pull this off, but we're currently planning to do 3 things over reunions weekend. One will be a music event. We're still, Heather's not on anymore, but we're trying to work something out there. Another thing will be a class mixer, which will give us the opportunity to pretend that we're standing under the tent talking. And then the third thing will be hopefully something in the line of what we did last year with Bart Gelman, a book talk, and we're trying to line that up right now too. With that, I would say we're getting tighter on these. It's not even 10 o'clock. And I want to thank everybody for coming, and we'll see you all in May and hopefully before then. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Jordan.
All right.